One of the characteristics of great leaders is that they're storytellers. Not only do they know how to tell a good story, but they know how to live that story. As you know, stories are not just intellectual. What we call facts are intellectual, but when facts are connected to story, then they acquire a soul. And this course is all about the soul. So let me start with a story. It goes back a long time. When I was about 7 years of age, living in a little town in India. It's not a little town anymore. It's a big town, big city actually, called Jabalpur in the state of Madhya Pradesh in central India. And as I said, I was 7 years of age. My younger brother, who later became the Dean of Education at Harvard Medical School, was then around 4. My father was an army doctor, first in the British Army and then in the Indian Army. And my mother was the most beautiful mother in the world. And we read in the newspapers that the founding Prime Minister of India, Mr. Nehru, most of you will not know who Mr. Nehru was, but he was the heir to Mahatma Gandhi and the first Prime Minister of India after India became a free country, after almost 200 years of British colonialism. So he was a big hero. And we read in the newspaper that he was coming to our town, Jabalpur, to cut a ribbon at an automobile factory that was just being launched in partnership with Mercedes-Benz. So for 3 weeks, there was only one conversation in our house all the time. What was the color of the sari that my mother would wear for the occasion? And of course, my father would tease her about Mr. Nehru not being interested in her sari or whatever. And she would say, just wait and see. So on the day that Mr. Nehru's motorcade was to go past the street, rather on the street in front of our house, we were there at 4 o'clock in the morning. My father was wearing his army uniform with World War II medals. He was a decorated war hero. And my mother was wearing an amazingly beautiful pink sari. So we were there at 4 o'clock on the streets. And by 7 o'clock, there were millions of people on the street. And in India, when I say millions, it means millions. It doesn't mean hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. It means millions. So there were people as far as the eye could see. 9 o'clock, 5 hours after we'd been there, with hardly room to breathe, we saw the motorcade turn the corner before our house. It was a very simple motorcade. Mr. Nehru was standing in a jeep wearing a white Nehru jacket. He had a red rose in his lapel, which was his signature. There was a jeep in the front, there was a jeep in the back, and it was slowly turning the corner, coming to the street where we were. Very slowly. The crowd went crazy. Long live Nehru, long live India, long live Mahatma Gandhi, even though Mahatma Gandhi was already not there. He had been assassinated, but Nehru reminded everyone of Gandhi. So here it is. It slowly goes by us. And I swear to God, I'm not lying right now. I can recall this in slow motion. As soon as it went by us, Mr. Nehru turned. He seemed to look directly at my mother amongst the millions of people. He took his rose out and he threw it at her. The crowd gasped and stepped backward, except for my mother, who stepped forward like a queen, picked up the rose and looked at my father and said, "Daddy, what did I tell you? Let's go home." And she led the way back home, and we all followed. And I knew in that moment she was the leader in the house, even though my father wore all the medals. In any case, we went to the house and we emptied a room which used to be our library and meditation room as well. And she removed all the furniture in the room except for one table right in the middle of the room, a vase, and the rose. And for the next 3 weeks, people came to our house to look at the rose. It was the talk of the town that Mr. Nehru threw a rose at Mrs. Chopra. In India, when you enter a place of veneration, you take off your shoes. So when they came to this room, they would take off their shoes. They would tiptoe right up to the center where the rose stood solitary in a vase, and they would just look at it in silence. Nothing else. And the room would be filled with some kind of, what I can say, some kind of consciousness or energy that was very difficult to describe. Well, after 3 weeks, the rose started to fade, as all things ultimately must if they're real. And then my mother had a party. She invited her best friends. And at the end of the party, everybody got a faded rose petal. And you should have seen how they received that rose, like an emerald, a diamond, a jewel, a family heirloom. And they took that petal and they would put it in a sacred book so they could preserve it or keep it forever and maybe even pass it on to their next generation. So afterwards, I asked my mother, I said, what was so strangely amazing about those rose petals? And my mother said something that I never forgot. She said those rose petals represented the soul of India. Strange concept, the soul of India. And I asked her, what does that mean? And she explained to me that Mahatma Gandhi was actually the symbolic expression of all the dreams and all the longings and all the aspirations and all the desires of the collective consciousness of India, that he represented them. He had, without firing a single bullet, obtained independence from 200 years of what Indians considered slavery in a way. And so he was their hero and their higher consciousness that could actualize what everybody was dreaming. Same as like Martin Luther King when he said, I have a dream. And it was the ability to take a collective dream and make it real. Since Mahatma Gandhi was no longer there and Mr. Nehru was his heir and not only spiritual heir but the political leader of the country, those dreams were basically now embodied in the persona of Mr. Nehru. And since he always wore this rose, that looking at the rose reminded them of their dream and their longing. That kind of ideas became part of my consciousness, even though I was not able to articulate it. Many years later, as I started thinking about leadership, I realized that's what a great leader is. I'm not talking about good leaders, I'm not talking about extraordinary leaders, I'm talking about extraordinarily great leaders. They are the symbolic soul of a group consciousness, and they act as a catalyst for change and transformation. A great leader doesn't have to be a manager. A manager manages what's already happening. Hopefully a good manager does that very efficiently. But a great leader actually changes the way people think, the way people speak, the way people imagine, the way people create. So a great leader unlocks the potential of greatness in others, and that ultimately manifests a collective dream. That's the basis of our course, The Soul of Leadership, to understand the mechanics of unlocking the greatness that is inherent in every human being, in every child. So as I looked at the qualities of a leader, I really realized, through much research and much understanding, that great leaders have certain qualities that go beyond just storytelling and living those stories. They have these qualities because they are connected with their soul.